Well, hi, my name is Melissa Lenczewski. I am a professor at Northern Illinois University, and today I'm going to be talking about water resources in Southeast Asia, some of the work that I have been doing on research projects, and also talk about water quality in general, so that you get some idea of what needs to go into water quality. And specifically, I'm going to be targeting groundwater. So we'll talk about all that today. So first, I thought I'd really quickly just introduce where I'm from. I'm from Northern Illinois University, which is in the center part of the United States, outside of Chicago. And our university is a medium-sized university. We've got about 18,000 students. But one of the features that I always love to point out is that we have the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. We teach Khmer. We have a very strong relationship with Cambodia. And I'm very excited to be continuing on with that tradition here today. My area of research is what's called contaminant hydrogeology. Well, what is that? I study pollution. So as we do things at the surface of the planet, it gets into our groundwater, and that is the hydrogeology part of this. So the water that is below the surface. And so I look at pollution and contamination that occurs, especially in urban areas or in tourist regions. So my research is on water quality of Southeast Asia, which I'll focus on today. I'll talk some about some water quality issues related to tourism, especially in Mexico. And I also do stuff in my hometown of DeKalb in Illinois. So why do I study groundwater specifically? Well, when we look at the water resources on the planet, we have most of it is saline, so it's in our oceans. Only 3% of our water on our planet is fresh. Of that fresh water, most of it right now is frozen in glaciers, so about 70%, and that number is decreasing as we have climate change. So of our freshwater resources on our planet, groundwater makes up the most of it. It's invisible to most people because it's below the ground, but it is the largest reservoir of fresh water on the planet, a lot more than our lakes, swamps, rivers, anything that you can see on the surface. So when we look at the water cycle, we can see that this is all groundwater here. So everything that we're doing at the surface from rain and rivers and industrial processes and stuff feeds into our groundwater, and our groundwater feeds into these ecosystems. And so this resource here works in our agricultural areas, our industrial. We drink it for groundwater resources. Communities use it as a way of banking water. And so it is part of our water cycle. So groundwater is, if you've ever dug a hole and you get down and the water starts to fill into it, that's groundwater. Groundwater is just where all of the pores or the areas between the grains of sand or clay are filled with water. This is a very dynamic system. Groundwater moves up and down. So it could be dry season, and the groundwater levels could be about 4 meters below the surface. Then during wet season, it rises back up and it can hit the surface or even be above the surface. So in a lot of areas, especially where we have rice fields, that water table is moving up and down. So depending on the time of year, you might be doing different types of crops, from corn or bananas, and then switching on over to rice. And so you can have this very dynamic way of looking at water. One of the things that I do really work on is this groundwater surface water interaction. So as we're putting things into our environment, we discharge water into our streams, our rivers. We put waste. We have water as it's raining. That runoff from our streets gets into our streams in there. That water then can feed into our groundwater, and it also our groundwater feeds into our streams. And so this area of dynamics between what we're doing at our stream levels, our rivers and our lakes, and our groundwater is really kind of important to me. The area that I work on is what's called water quality. So I look at, is it healthy to drink? Is it not just for us as humans, but also for plants and animals and for our ecosystem? So we look at like the chemical side of things. So if you've taken a chemistry class, what's the pH? How acid or basic is it? I look at the biology of the water. So we look at how many E. coli. So that's bacteria that are found usually in our gut. And so these are bacteria that can cause disease. So we can get, you've ever had food poisoning, or you've had water that's contaminated. That's why you boil the water or you drink bottled water in there. And then there's also the aesthetic side of water. So, have you ever smelled water and it smells bad or it looks really bad? It's got a lot of iron into it because it turns red. Those could be problems in there. So we look at the condition of water relative to these things, relative to our human needs. And so to our ecosystem, make sure that the fish and the wildlife is still thriving with inside of it, and then also that humans have safe drinking water to drink. And then water quality is also gone by regulations, so there could be a lot of compliance issues. So this is regulations on what you should be able to find in water to make sure that water is safe for everything within inside of the ecosystem. Contamination can happen from a lot of different sources. So you could have agrochemicals. So this is in your agricultural fields where you are adding nutrients, and I'll talk more about those, or even pesticides and herbicides. So pesticides and herbicides are there to kill off insects that are eating your plants. Well, that chemical can then get into your drinking water supply, and that could hurt us as humans. There could be things from illegal dumping, so trash that's put places, or industrial waste. You can get spills. You can have gasoline stations that leak. The other thing that I've seen is like the 1 liter bottles that people come in and fill up those motos with. Well, that 1 liter bottle, if it spills onto the ground, does that get into it? Gasoline contains a chemical called benzene, and benzene's a known cancer-causing agent, so it's known to cause cancer with people who drink it or handle it. And so as gasoline is spilled into the environment, is that getting in there and leading to more cancer? We also have sewage, sewage treatment plants or lack of sewage treatment plants that discharge wastewater into the ground, which then feeds into our groundwater contamination. We could have landfills. We could have industry that makes something, and I'll talk more about that. And so everything that we do at the surface can lead into this contamination of groundwater. Now, sometimes we can do what is called point source pollution. We can point to an industry or point to something and say they are causing the water problem. But most of the time when we look at groundwater pollution, it's what's called non-point source. It's all the agricultural fields. It's runoff. It's a mix of everything. And, it's all of the streets of the city and all of the spilled oils and gases that are on there. It's you can't point a finger at one person, but you can say across this entire area, it's just causing pollution to occur. And so these are usually we're dealing with non-point source pollution. So we can't say who's doing it, but we want to know if you do something at the surface, how is that getting into our groundwater, and then who's that impacting later on? So when we look at water, there's also water regulations. Water regulations in the United States are set by the Environmental Protection Agency, or US EPA. That was started over 50 years ago because we wanted to make sure that our air and our water was clean to drink. Because of setting up the Environmental Protection Agency, our national bird, the bald eagle, went from almost being extinct to now coming back and thriving. We've seen a lot of species come back. We've seen better quality water. And so what we do is we regulate water through the Environmental Protection Agency, and we have what are things that are called MCLs. And MCL is a maximum contaminant level. It is the maximum amount of each compound or chemical or biological agent that is found in water that would make us sick. So we say, okay, as long as the water is below this level, you should be okay. So it sets things, and the two that I'm going to talk about is nitrogen and E. coli. Well, why do we look at those? So E. coli, or coliform bacteria, are bacteria that are found inside of our gut. They help us digest food, but they could also lead to diarrhea and disease. And so we use them as what's called an indicator organism. So it indicates that there's feces in our water. So if we find E. coli, we know that there's feces, which then could potentially make us sick. So when we look at cases of violations or having these compounds in our water, we see that coliforms is the number one thing that we find in water. And so we regulate it to that you should never find this in water. If you find this, it means that the water has been contaminated with feces. The next big one is nitrate and nitrogens, which is caused by agriculture. We'll talk more about that, but agriculture puts on nitrogen compounds into our fields. That nitrogen helps our plants grow bigger. So we fertilize, we put nitrogen, we put phosphorus, we put potassium onto our soils, and that helps our plants grow bigger. So as we have larger populations of people on this planet, we need to produce more food. And so one way we can do this is have our plants put out more food faster, stronger. And so we put nitrogen compounds into our environment to help our plants grow better. In your area here, there's a problem with arsenic, especially in groundwater resources along the Mekong River. I'm not going to talk about that today. I don't research that, but this is a major problem in your area, so you might want to talk more about that later on. So one of the things that reasons we talk about nitrogen, or these compounds that make plants grow bigger, is because of blue baby syndrome. So blue baby syndrome is infants that are less than 6 months old have different hemoglobin or blood than we do as adults. So what happens is if they drink water that contains nitrate into it, it starves their cells. That nitrate binds to our blood cells, our red blood cells, and then it doesn't allow the cells to breathe. It doesn't bring oxygen to all of our cells. The children turn blue because they're suffocating inside of there, and it can cause death and problems for children. So we regulate the amount of nitrogen inside of our compounds. The other reason that we want to limit the amount of nitrogen and phosphate, while it is very important to grow more food, what can happen is because that causes plants to grow so much faster, when it gets into water, it can cause eutrophication. So eutrophication is when we're adding this increasing too much nitrogen and phosphorus to the water. What happens is the algae that live inside of that water take it up and go crazy. They're like, yeah, we're growing. And so they grow like crazy, and they grow so much that they die off and decay into the water. When this process happens, when this process occurs, it uses up all of the oxygen in the water. Well, fish, the lobsters, the shrimp in here need to be able to breathe underwater, so they use that oxygen in the water. Well, when this happens, we get what's called a dead zone, and these dead zones are where there's not enough oxygen inside of the water for animals to live. So we have in the United States along the Gulf of Mexico and the eastern seaboard lots of dead zone areas. You might have this here too, especially in Tonlé Sap, where you get too much nutrients into there. You'll get these fish kills. You'll get the water then becomes, so it's not producing food for people. And so we have to be very careful of these too much algae getting into water because of these dead zones. The other problem with algae is some algae, and this is what I'm talking about, we get so much harmful algal blooms. There's just so much algae growing on the water that it starts to smell bad. It's just, and the water is dead, basically. Is the water can also produce what are called microcystins. Microcystins are harmful algal blooms. These are toxins that the algae produce. And they get inside of the drinking water and they can cause problems to your human liver, diarrhea, rashes. And they're toxic at a concentration of 1 microgram per liter, 1 ppb. So very, very small concentrations of this can cause health problems, can lead to liver disease inside of people. And so in the United States, we had a whole city that water was pumped from a lake. It's called Lake Erie. That lake had so much algae growing into it that the toxin was in the water. And so no one could bathe, no cooking with the water, nothing with the water, because even coming in contact it would cause rashes and irritation. And this was fresh water, one of the big Great Lakes in the United States. Well, that's kind of an introduction. So now I'm going to start focusing on some of the research that I've been doing here in Southeast Asia. So this is research that I did in Mandalay, Myanmar. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the research there in Myanmar first, then to Cambodia. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about Mexico. So I was working in Mandalay, Myanmar. Mandalay is in the center part of this country of Burma or Myanmar. Mandalay is here. This is the Irrawaddy River. It flows right next to it. And I was looking at the southern part of the city in a community called Amarapura. This region down in the south, there's a university down here, and it's a major freshwater resource. And it kind of acts like some of the areas here in Cambodia where during the wet season, water flows into the lake. It makes it very easy for fishing. And then during dry season, it flows out into the Irrawaddy River. And so there's that back and forth movement of water. And that should sound familiar to you in your country, but this is at a much smaller scale. Okay. So we went around the area and we looked at how people were getting fresh water. So part of the fresh water was with these dug wells. These were put in, we would ask everybody and they would say 100 years ago, but I think it just meant a long time ago. They're brick lined. People use a bucket. They get the water out of them. They use them for bathing, cooking, washing dishes. They're for the whole community. So a community will have one of these dug wells for it. You can also have tube wells. These are wells made out of PVC pipe. So this is that blue pipe you see everywhere. It is dug into the ground. It can be anywhere from 10, 15 to 60 meters deep. They're around 5 centimeters in diameter. And what happens is those are pumped out of the water is pumped using an electric pump, or you can use a hand pump. And that water is brought to the surface, and then it can be used for drinking. Because this water is coming through the ground and that soil acts as a filter, generally it's cleaner than surface water to drink. So in a lot of places, in order to have clean drinking water where the surface water will cause disease, a lot of times people will place these wells in and use that for the drinking water resource. So, we have to think about human health and communities in there, especially rural communities. One of the things we noticed was drinking water. These are these jugs that were there. This is a water treatment plant that was right next to a sewer canal. The sewage or wastewater is just in these canals, these areas right next to people's homes. And remember, I talked about surface water, groundwater interaction. This water can get into the ground, and then there's a well right next to it that they pump that tube well up to drink the water, and so they can be actually causing pollution of their own well. Wastewater then flows down, and then it's pumped into the Irrawaddy River. You've probably seen this in some of the canals here in Cambodia, filled with plastic, and then these really black water. In Mexico, they call it agua negra, which means black water. That is filled with all of the waste from the community, is then pumped into the Irrawaddy River. And then that, if you live downstream from that, then you're pumping out your drinking water from the river. You could be getting sick from the communities that are upstream. And we noticed that with some of the river contamination. We went with a group of faculty members from the university, and we stopped and talked to some monks, and they would talk about how the river that flowed by them all of a sudden one day would change color or smell, and then there would be fish dead everywhere. The lake that is near the university, even the faculty said one day it just smelled bad, and then by the afternoon everything was dead. All the fish were dead in the lake. So a lot of times contamination doesn't just come from sewage, but it also comes from industries. So if industries can take whatever waste they have and put it into the river to get rid of that waste, that river flows downstream and can affect other people. Also, that river water can get into our groundwater, and then we pump it up for drinking, and we think it's safe. And it's not, because we've been putting pollution in there, and that pollution can get from that surface water into our groundwater resources. So we have to be careful of that. And I mentioned about algae and algal blooms. This is algae growing on the surface of the lake here. And so there's a lot of fishing communities inside of there that rely on the lake. And so this is algae that's on top of it. So we went and we collected water from different groundwater wells, and then we tested the water in the laboratories. We did some site characterizations. We went and sampled surface water, groundwater, to see if there's a link between the two. Because, that is one of the big things that we're looking at is what are we doing at the surface and what does that do into our groundwater resources. So I'm going to move this out of the way, and I'm going to just show this real quick, and then I'll bring back that table here. So what this is one of the wells that we dealt with. So this was, we called it Dug Well number 10. And what it is this is one of those dug wells. So it's a big community well inside of there, right up in here. The local community calls it Sweetwater. When we were sampling this water, there was a fish in it. And we're like, why is there a fish in your drinking water or your water resources? And they're like, oh yeah, if the fish is alive and swimming, we know the water's okay. When the fish dies, we know that we shouldn't use that water. I'm like, okay, that's one way of looking at it. And so one thing we noticed was this right here next to it. This is sewage. So the city, again, like you do here in Phnom Penh, the water goes into these canals. These canals are not lined here. This is just soil right here. And their water within inside of this well's level was about that same level there. And so there was only a few meters of soil between the raw sewage and the water inside of this well that people were using on a daily basis for different purposes, for cleaning and everything in there. And so we wanted to sample this well to see if it was really clean or not. So let me move my table back over here, and let's put this over here. So what did I find when we sampled that well? Well, first of all, pH. So pH is how acidic or basic it is. We set a level that we'd like to see your pH to be at between 6.8 and 8.5. 6.5 and 8.5. That's a range. So the pH of that water was 7.65. So that's good. EH, we want it to be a positive number. This tells us how oxidizing or reducing a water is. So oxidizing environments is where we live, so we can breathe in there. So it meant that the water had oxygen in it. We talked about for fish. Next is conductivity, or electrical conductivity, or specific conductivity. So this is how salty is water. So salt gets into water from different sources. So from sewage, when we eat food, we put salt, table salt on our food. There's a lot of ions inside of that water, which then allow for water to be more conductive. So this is, with electricity. So we don't want a lot of salt in our water. Our water, if it's salty and it's got a lot of ions into it, tastes bad, but those ions could also be bad for our health. So we set the maximum that we can drink and actually taste levels into there is less than 1,500 microsiemens per centimeter. This water was twice as salty. Well, where did that salt come from? More than likely the sewage. Turbidity is how cloudy is the water. We like our water nice and clean. When we have bottled water, we like it to be able to see through. So we like our turbidity less than 1. This is turbidity units. This water was at 10. Sulfate. Sulfate can cause diarrhea, other gastroenteritis problems. The maximum level that we like to see is about 250. This had 400. Chloride, sodium chloride is table salt. We want to see about 50. We had 500. So we know that it was salt. Probably table salt that was causing a lot of this conductivity. Nitrates, that blue baby syndrome leading to algal blooms and everything. We set the level of 40. We had 167. So 4 times more nitrates into it. Fluoride, teeth, makes your teeth. That's why we brush your teeth with fluoride. Maximum level is 1.5. When we start getting above that level, we start to get like spots on our teeth, bone problems in there. The level was above that, not that much more, so just a little bit. Arsenic. So again, the Mekong River is known for, there's some areas along the Mekong River where there's arsenic inside of the groundwater. That arsenic can cause mental retardation, especially amongst children. The current maximum level that you should have is 10 parts per billion. But there's been some studies that shows that it even affects children as low as 5 parts per billion. So arsenic is very bad for mental capacity. Also causes a lot of other health issues that you could get into. We found 30 inside of there. And then E. coli, that bacteria of the gut, was at 0. And we found that it was at greater than 1,000, greater than 100 inside of that water in there. Well, another project I wanted to talk today was about one of the industries that's in that region called, it's a dyeing operations. So they take threads and fabrics and they dye them all these beautiful colors to make fabrics. The laundries. And so a lot of the dyes are bought in India and China. This particular area of Myanmar, especially the Maripur area, is known for textile dyeing. They've been using natural dyes in the 1820s, and then even through today, this is the area where this is made. So this is the hometown industries. This is what people do in their yards. And so what we wanted to look at is we noticed that the water would change color. And I'm like, where is this changing colors are coming from? Well, as the families are dyeing the different threads and yarns that go into making for the laundries, the color is disposed of or dumped onto the ground. And again, that surface water, groundwater interaction, that water moving into our rivers and lakes. So we wanted to investigate that. So we found out that a lot of these textiles industries are done in people's homes. They boil water and they dye them, and then this water then is dumped onto the ground, and then it flows into the lake and then into the river. We talked to people. So a lot of these dyes we found out were purchased at the local market. You could go to the market and buy all the different colors that you needed into there, and the dyes were coming from India and China. And so these brightly colored things were coming in, and people would just whatever color they wanted to make that day. So we looked at the water that was being disposed of from these areas as it goes into our lakes and rivers and is dumped onto the ground. You can kind of see some green colors here. All of a sudden it would turn pink. People would walk through it, or their dogs, and the dogs would be dyed. And so these things are just different colors as they're working on them throughout the day. So also in this area was the weaving of the things, and they would have them drying out here, and so you could they would be manufactured right there, the fabric. So we went and we collected, we went to the different markets and we bought all the different color dyes we could find. We figured out where they were from. Almost all of them were from China, one from India. And we tested the different colors to see what made them up. So what is inside of these dyes? And we went around and sampled these areas right here and here. These areas are where most of the textile dyeing happens. In these regions. So these are the regions that we worked in. We would sample some of the wells that were in those areas, and we would ask people about their water. And when we asked them about their water, they would say, like, oh, the rice would turn different colors. So it would turn yellow or green, and they did not see the link between what they were doing on the surface and these textile dyings and the water getting into their drinking water supplies and what they were using for cooking. So we looked at the heavy metals in there. We looked at wells that were up gradient at the site and then down. So up gradient means it was upstream. So it was not where the dyeing was occurring. So we looked at areas that where the dyeing was not occurring, and mostly the water was good, just that sodium. And remember I talked about sodium with sewage getting into water supplies, and so that was it. So that's the only thing we saw in these upstream. When we looked at the groundwater in the tube wells that were right next to the dyeing operations, we started to see toxic levels of different types of metals, heavy metals. So things like thallium, which is one of the most toxic metals that there is in the world. We saw iron, we saw lead, we saw aluminum inside of it. As we looked at what water was being pumped out of these places, like here's a pink day, we started seeing aluminum, iron, lead, nickel, sodium, thallium, these very toxic heavy metals that were getting into the streams that can cause health and problems for people. And so this is just some of the health effects that you can have and where we set those maximum contaminant levels. So during wet season versus dry season, we would see that the water would flow and get into people's drinking water supplies, that the wells that were upstream were good, and then as this dyeing operations are here, we would get this water flowing through the systems in there and causing people's health problems. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I've done here in Cambodia. One of the things that you've all seen is these canals that run right by the universities and through the areas are these canals, and these are just raw sewage. So as you flush your toilet, as you're taking a shower, as you're doing any cooking inside of any of the buildings, it goes into these sewer canals, and these sewer canals lead down to the bong. There's a couple of them in the area that they can lead into. So we wanted to focus on Bang Tumpan in the southern part, and one of the reasons, as you probably know, there is development in that area. They are filling in the wetland in here, and in order for more development. So this is Eon Mall 3, that one that's down here in the center part of the area. So if you've been down to it, that area is for massive development right now. So they started, as you can see, it used to be a lot more green, and now it's getting filled in with the sand. Each one of these little dots is our sampling locations. So wetlands work great, and they work great as a way to take a lot of the pollutants out of our sewage before we discharge it into our rivers. So ecosystem, we call it ecosystem services, is where these wetlands have a way of feeding into our rivers and our waterways. And so these waterways, these treatment that happens inside of there, it feeds into the wetlands. The wetlands remove a lot of the nutrients, removes that salt, removes that thing, and acts as a way before it gets discharged into our rivers as a great way. Well, here we're not seeing that. We have a grate that removes some of the plastics and some of the big things, and then it goes into this treatment, but this treatment is being filled in and being removed here, and then it's going right into the rivers. And so as this is being filled in, we wanted to see what was that effect. Is this hurting the water quality that's in the area? There is a proposed wastewater treatment plant. So this is a plant that removes a lot of those nutrients from the water that's in there. And so this lake right here right now acts as a giant way of treating the water, but if they fill it in, they have to treat the water and spend a lot of money, billions of dollars, in order to create something that your wetland already does. They're building one right there. I think I showed some pictures of the pilot plant to see if it can work, if we can actually construct something to replace the ecosystem services of the lake. So we investigated the sewage. There's agriculture, floating agriculture that happens on the lake. And then all the sewage from everybody's homes just leads right into the lake. And so this black water here is actually sewage, and then there's agriculture, floating agriculture, that happens on surface. So you can take boats out into the lake to sample as we talk about surface water. Some of the things that are grown on there is the water spinach and the water mimosas that are used for food. So it's not inside of the plant, but what happens is the plant grows inside of it, that nutrients that are inside of there, the different things that are in there, they grow, and then if it's not washed thoroughly, you can have problems. So make sure you always wash your vegetables thoroughly. So you get this floating agriculture, you put these mats down, and then you put the water mimosas and the water spinach on top, and then you grow them on top of the sewage water. And then since 2012, this is being developed. So here's 2017, here's 2023. As we see development occurring into those areas, you can see how it's all being filled in with sand in there. And so what was a lot of agriculture for food is now being turned into buildings, malls, and also the sewage has less time for treatment because it is being all just filled in with sand. I mentioned agriculture and pesticides and fertilizers. These are just some of the compounds that were used for the area, and these compounds are just thrown onto the thing. People don't really know. They go to the market, and in those markets they put the stuff onto sprayers into there, but they really don't know what they're putting into the water to make the plants grow better. So the lake, this is from 2023, this is 06, and so it was still pretty good size, 2010, and then in 2012 is when the development started, when they thought we need more land here, and so we are going to fill in the area, and so put sand into there to build the road. So this is the Hun Sen Road that goes right in through there. And then 2016, you can see it's developing more. Than by 2022, all the little areas that have been filled in. So what we wanted to know was what happens to that sewage treatment. Do we still have it that's going on there, even though we're filling it up? Are we hitting a tipping point yet that the water is not being treated? Is it still good? And there's so we wanted to look at that. So we went out and we tested the water that goes into the lake. This is the new pilot plant that they're building right in this location to take the sewage and to run it through a very small plant that's really not designed for the millions of people that live here. Other sources is like from the brewery, the effluent. I mentioned industry just dumping things into it. So this is industrial effluent that goes into this area and then feeds right into the lake. And so we also looked at the part that discharges into the rivers. So as it goes through the wetlands, what happens when it reaches the end? And we sampled some of the wells down there. And so we went to the same location. Here it is in 2017. Here we are in 2022, sampling some of the areas. Here is Eon Mall 3, and the wetland has been filled in. There's roads now into there. There's a lot of construction that occurs inside of there, when before it was a giant lake. And then this water discharges into the river, and so at the end of this it discharges into here. So as it goes through that wetland, it treats it and it comes out the end, but we're filling it in. So we looked at the water, and we looked at it in dry season and wet season. I'm just going to show a little bit of the results today, and this is from our in 2018. So we looked at the water. We looked at some nutrients like phosphate, which we put on plants, ammonia, and chloride. And we looked at it from the influent to the effluent points in here, and we saw that it was doing a good job. It was really doing a good job to remove these nutrients that was in there before we filled it in too much. Now what we're trying to do is we went and sampled. We're still getting the results from those, and what we'd like to do is look at those results and see if there's still, the wetland is still functioning. At what point do we hit that tipping point that it no longer functions to remove waste, and that the small wastewater treatment plant that's being built is not going to be enough. We're going to do some statistical analysis of the data. We're also going to look at the percent of land use change, so how much has been filled in since 2017. We're sampling major anions and cations inside of that water to see if there's anything inside of that water that could be in there. So we're looking at those nutrients, those fertile, the stuff we make the plants grow better. And then we're trying to answer the question, is this new pilot plant, is this really going to be enough or how much? So we're going to spend a lot of money to build wastewater treatment plants when we had a very functioning lake at it. So with that, I'm going to leave you. That's it for today. I hope you found this interesting. It's very interesting research. We go out into the communities. We sample right there. It's part of the research that I'm doing here. So thank you very much.